On a cold November morning in 1849, in a story passed down through generations of oral tradition, a cotton merchant named Josiah Pemberton was found dead in a tobacco barn outside a small Mississippi town. The overseer who found him told the sheriff it looked like suicide, a rope, a beam, a broken man. The sheriff, eager to close the case, didn't look too closely. He didn't notice that Pemberton's hands were bound behind his back. You cannot hang yourself with your hands tied. This is the story, as legend tells it, of a man who moved through plantations like smoke, a man who was bought and sold and bought again, and who left a trail of unexplained deaths in his wake. The enslaved people who whispered about him in the dark, long after the overseers had gone to sleep, gave him a name. They called him Moses. Not because he led anyone to freedom in the way the Bible tells it, though some say he did that too. They called him Moses because, like the angel of death passing over Egypt, wherever he went, the powerful began to fall. This is his story. It never happened, but it could have. August 1832, Richmond, Virginia. In our story, the auction block that morning held a man of about 28, listed in the ledger only as Daniel. The auctioneer's notes read, "Prime field hand, strong back, no defects. Some resistance noted." Marcus Ashworth, a tobacco planter, paid little attention to that last line. He saw only muscle and endurance paid the price and had the man marched in chains to his plantation 40 miles west. Ashworth ran his estate the way most planters did it, through violence delegated to overseers, while he himself stayed comfortably removed from the daily brutality. He thought of himself as a businessman. He was not. Daniel arrived at the plantation with 4 others. He was processed, assigned a number, and put to work in the fields under men who ruled through the whip. For 3 months he gave the overseers nothing to notice. He kept his head down. He worked without complaint. But in our story, Daniel was not simply enduring, he was studying. The patrol routes, the overseers' habits, who drank too much at night, which doors didn't lock, which of the enslaved workers could be trusted with silence. And he waited. November 1832. The first overseer to die in this story was a man named Cobb, known for a hickory cane he used on the backs of workers' legs, a punishment cruel enough to cripple but clean enough not to lower a man's price at market. Cobb was found at the bottom of a curing barn, neck broken, seemingly having fallen from the drying racks above. The plantation doctor called it an accident. Bruises on the arms were written off as impact marks. In our story, those bruises were fingertip-shaped, the kind left by someone holding a man down. No one investigated further. Cobb was buried. A new overseer was hired within the week. Over the following year in this tale, overseer after overseer at the plantation meets an end that could just barely be explained away. One vanishes on patrol, his horse returning alone at dusk. One collapses in a field at midday, his water flask smelling faintly wrong. One is found in his locked room, the door somehow open, a pillow's crease pressed too deep against his face. Each time the plantation doctor finds a natural explanation. Each time in the quarters, in conversations no white man ever heard, understanding spreads a little further. Someone is fighting back, someone patient, someone precise. And each time, the planter, unable to prove anything but unable to shake his unease quietly, sells Daniel to someone else. In this story, over the next several years, Daniel is sold from Virginia to North Carolina, to South Carolina, to Georgia, to Louisiana, and back again 12 plantations across the Deep South. And at each one, the same quiet pattern repeats. He arrives unnoticed. He learns the land and the people who run it. And within months, the men most feared by the enslaved community begin to die in ways that never quite add up. No two deaths look alike. No official report ever draws a line between them. That is the fictional premise at the heart of this story, not a supernatural avenger, but a man who understood that a system built on making him invisible had made itself blind to him in return. In this story, Daniel's next stop is a massive cotton estate called Thornhill in North Carolina, owned by a man named Benjamin Garrett. Nearly 5,000 acres, 280 enslaved people, 9 overseers, a more sophisticated operation than Ashworth's, and in its own way, a crueler one. Daniel arrives in late August. He is assigned to a work gang, given his tools, shown his sleeping space, and once again, for 2 months, he gives no one a reason to look at him twice. He watches. He learns which overseer beats without cause and which merely enforces the rules handed down to him. He learns the difference between a man who is cruel because the system rewards cruelty and a man who is cruel because he enjoys it. In this story, Daniel does not punish indifference. He punishes enjoyment. The first to fall at Thornhill is a man named Sloan in our story, the worst of the 9. A man who has, by reputation, forced a runaway to dig his own grave and stand in it for half a day as punishment. A man who has beaten women who were pregnant. Sloan is found dead in his locked room, his face discolored, his door somehow unlocked from the inside. The doctor calls it a stroke. No one asks why his pillow shows the deep crease of something pressed down with force. 2 months later, an overseer named Drummond disappears entirely while riding the property line. His horse returns at dusk with an empty saddle. No trace of him is ever found. Then an overseer named Thornton dies when his gentle, well-trained horse allegedly throws him during morning rounds. Though experienced horsemen in the story note that such an animal doesn't simply buck without cause, and that the saddle girth shows cuts too clean to be accidental wear. 3 overseers gone in 4 months. Garrett in this story becomes a frightened man. He doubles patrols. He arms every overseer. He interrogates the enslaved workers with brutal intensity, searching for a conspiracy he cannot prove exists. He finds nothing. The silence around Daniel is absolute, not because everyone knows what he has done, but because in a system built on suspicion and punishment, no one profits from speculation. Whether they suspect him or not, no one will say his name to a white man. And so, just as Ashworth did before him, Garrett quietly sells Daniel unable to prove anything, unable to shake the feeling that keeping this particular man on his land is a kind of slow-burning danger he doesn't have the words for. Over the next several years in this story, Daniel, sometimes called Daniel, sometimes given a new name by each new owner, his real name never recorded anywhere, passes through plantation after plantation across the Deep South. A rice estate in South Carolina, a second cotton plantation in Georgia, a sugar plantation in Louisiana where the work is, if anything, even more lethal than cotton or tobacco. Back east again to a tobacco farm in Virginia. At every stop, the same quiet rhythm repeats. Arrival, silence, observation. And then, within months, a death that never quite adds up. A slave catcher who disappears into a swamp while tracking a runaway, his dogs found alive but strangely unwilling to continue the trail. A plantation manager who drowns in a creek his own son insists was never more than waist deep. A county patrol captain who dies in his sleep, no mark on him at all. The local doctor citing an affliction of the heart because there is no other explanation on hand and no one particularly wants to look for one. In this story, word begins to travel not through newspapers which report nothing, and not through official channels which connect nothing, but through the informal network that runs beneath the plantation system. Enslaved people moved between estates by sale, by hire, by errand, carrying news in the only form safe to carry it, a name spoken quietly, never explained, Moses. Some who hear the name believe it refers to different men entirely, each responsible for a single death in a single county, and that the pattern is only a story people tell to give themselves hope. Others insist it is one man, moving with terrible patience through 5 states, choosing his targets with the same care an overseer once chose his. The fictional premise never resolves that question for the audience. That ambiguity is, in this telling, the point. By 1841, in this story, the deaths have become too consistent for everyone to ignore, even if no 2 counties compare notes. A private investigator, we'll call him Alastair Grimke, is hired by a consortium of planters worried about the rising toll among their overseers and slave patrols. Grimke is methodical, cynical, and unusually willing to consider a theory local sheriffs won't, that these deaths are connected and that whoever is responsible is not simply lashing out, but working a long, deliberate campaign. Grimke spends a year in this story tracing cell records, a task nearly impossible in a system that treats enslaved people as property rather than individuals worth tracking by name. But patient cross-referencing of auction ledgers, plantation account books, and county death reports across 5 states begins to reveal an unsettling geography. Certain deaths cluster suspiciously close in time to the recorded sale of a field hand answering to no single fixed name. In this fictional account, Grimke never gets close enough to make an arrest. Each time he arrives at a plantation to investigate, Daniel has already been sold on, sometimes mere weeks before Grimke's arrival, as though the pattern itself were a kind of early warning system that plantation owners followed without ever admitting why. The story leaves it deliberately unclear whether Daniel knows he is being hunted, or whether the planter's own guilty instincts are simply moving him along faster than any investigator could. In this fictional telling, we pause the narrative to consider what such a campaign, if it had been real, would have required. Not supernatural ability, not magic, just an intimate, hard-won knowledge of a system's blind spots, overseers who worked alone at night. Doctors paid to find the simplest explanation rather than the correct one. Sheriffs with no incentive to investigate the death of a man no one important missed. A form of resistance that depended entirely on the system's own contempt for the people it enslaved, the assumption that men and women kept in bondage were incapable of patience, of strategy, of complex sustained action. That assumption, this story suggests, was always the fatal flaw. Real historical resistance during American slavery took many well-documented forms: arson, work slowdowns, poisoning, escape, and organized rebellion, from Gabriel's conspiracy in 1800 to Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831 to the countless smaller, unrecorded acts of sabotage carried out on plantations across the South. This story's version of Daniel is invented, but the world he moves through and the vulnerabilities he is imagined to exploit are drawn from real historical conditions. In this story, the final chapter takes place in 1849 back in Mississippi, where we opened at the plantation of the cotton merchant Josiah Pemberton, the man found hanging with his hands bound. By this point in the story, Daniel is no longer young. 17 years of forced migration across the South have worn on him, though those who encounter him still describe the same unnerving stillness, the same watchfulness. Pemberton, in this telling, is not an overseer, but an owner, a man who has grown wealthy trading in human beings directly, buying and selling enslaved people at auction for profit rather than working them on his own land. Daniel is purchased as part of a group meant for resale, not for labor. In this story, that distinction matters. Pemberton keeps his human property in a barn on the edge of town while arranging transport to the next auction, and in doing so, unknowingly grants Daniel something he rarely has: proximity and time. Pemberton's death, as the story opened, is ruled a suicide by a sheriff eager to close the books on an unpleasant case. The bound hands are never explained because no one in an official capacity ever asks the question. In our fictional account, this is where Daniel's documented trail, such as it is, existing only in whispers, sale records, and the private letters of frightened planters, goes cold. Whether he was ever caught, whether he escaped north, whether he died anonymously, the way he seems to have wanted the world to remember his victims, the story leaves unanswered. That, too, is deliberate. The historical record on real resistance during slavery is full of exactly these silences, not because nothing happened, but because the people with the power to record history had every reason not to. This is a fictional story. There was no single man named Daniel or Moses who traveled through 5 states, executing slaveholders over 3 decades. No such pattern of 250 deaths has ever been documented by historians. But the story endures in this telling and in the broader oral tradition it draws from, because it answers something the sanitized version of American history often leaves out. The fact that enslaved people were not passive victims waiting on outside rescue. They resisted constantly in ways large and small, documented and undocumented, at enormous personal risk, using precisely the kind of intimate knowledge of a plantation's weaknesses that this story imagines Daniel using. If this story moved you, the real history is worth your time. Look into Nat Turner. Look into Gabriel Prosser and Denmark Vesey. Look into the Underground Railroad and the network of free and enslaved Black Americans who ran it at extraordinary risk. Look into the countless smaller acts, the slowed labor, the broken tools, the accidental fires that historians increasingly recognize as organized resistance rather than isolated incidents. The truth doesn't need embellishment. It only needs telling.